Good morning, all, and welcome to the PCA's second ever webinar. This time, all about Japanese knotweed, problem plant, or just a weed. I am your host, Andy Ferguson, and I'm delighted to say we have our very own Dr. Peter Fitzsimons. Hello, Peter.
Good morning, Andy.
Now, folks, many thanks for those that are joining us that little bit early, just at this moment in time. We do still have about 8 minutes or so until we're actually going to start. So just while we're waiting, let me just kind of point you out to just some stuff just within this webinar in itself. Now, for those that maybe want to say a wee quick hello to us, or you just want to kind of pose a question, if you are on a desktop computer, to either the right or to the left of you, you'll notice there's a chat functionality. All you simply need to do is just look for the kind of chat box, type in a bit of text and say hello. We're also keen that during just right over the webinar itself, feel free to pose any questions at any time. For those that are using a mobile device, it should be right below you. So if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see the chat functionality. Just feel free again, just to kind of pose any kind of questions in there. And just if you just want to say anything, or even if you kind of disagree, God forbid, with anything that we are having to say, then we're keen to hear your thoughts. If you're not so keen to use the chat functionality, you can contact us using our social media channels, either via Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. All you simply need to do is go to that appropriate channel, simply type in Property Care Association, and we should come up, and we are listening on those channels as well. And feel free to kind of pose any questions that you may actually have. Hopefully you've all got a lovely big cup of coffee, as it's very, very early in the morning. And may I also say a big hello to all the international audience that we actually have on board with us today. We all appreciate you actually coming on board, especially with the different kind of time zones. I imagine that there would have been some extra special early starts for some of you, but we really appreciate you coming on and kind of listening. I suppose while we're waiting, Peter, how are you? I seem to kind of think we're like ships passing in the night sometimes. I mean, how's life down your way? And hopefully you're all safe and well down your way.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Andy. Yeah, you know, we're opposite ends of the UK, but with the wonders of modern technology, it doesn't seem like that at all. So I guess for you, it's business as usual, because you're quite used to video conferencing all the time with your colleagues. So this is your time, really, isn't it?
Yeah, but well, do you know, I mean, I think it's a new experience for all of us, and I think all the audience out there as well, with us all kind of working at home, we all kind of appreciate the kind of difficulties and the challenges, I suppose, in terms of kind of communication and keeping in touch with all our kind of colleagues. But yes, I suppose I'm a wee bit more used to it than kind of most at the moment in time, but it's great. And the great thing is we actually have the technology now that we can actually shoehorn and get round about these obstacles. I mean, in terms of knotweed, Peter, I mean, just again, while we're waiting, we've got a bit of time to kill. Tell me, I mean, what is hot off the press in terms of knotweed? I mean, I've not chatted to you for a while. I mean, what's new in the world of knotweed and invasive weeds?
Well, obviously, an awful lot of what's new is going to be covered later on in the webinar, so I don't want to preempt that too much. But we've just had a very wet, very mild, very stormy winter, which has caused a lot of flooding around the country. And so Japanese knotweed has certainly been an issue in amongst all of that, because you know, it does exacerbate the intensity of flooding, just because of the amount of knotweed that's present in river basins. And causing you know, an increase in flood risks around weirs and bridges and that type of thing. But the main thing to note is that, of course, at this time of year, you know, the knotweed's starting to grow, so everybody's starting to notice it again. We get 3 months of the year to forget about it before it starts growing, but once it gets started, it grows fairly quickly, and this very mild weather we're having will give it a great head start this year for sure.
So what have you, just by chance, and I know we've not spoken about this, but have you had any reports yet about some early growth coming through?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, in fact, they probably started around about late February time down in places like Devon and Cornwall.
Oh, wow.
But then perhaps that's not so unusual because obviously they have a very mild temperate climate down there, fairly frost free. And of course, knotweed does tend to grow fairly early on in places like London, where there's a bit of a microclimate around the urban buildings. So, but I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of our members up in your neck of the woods around Glasgow are already starting to get a lot of phone calls regarding new growth being spotted in the spring.
Well, folks, we're almost getting to that time. For everyone that's just kind of joined us just over the last 5 minutes or so, big thank you for coming on board. I'm your host, Andy Ferguson from the PCA, and beside me on the camera, just at the bottom right corner, we've got Dr. Peter Fitzsimons, also from the PCA, who's going to be our presenter today. Just to draw your attention to everyone that's kind of new on board, we're keen to kind of hear your thoughts. We're kind of keen to hear any kind of questions or any thoughts that you actually have. Feel free to use that chat facility. If you're on a desktop, it should be either on your right or your left. Just simply use the text box and say hello. If you're using a mobile device, simply just scroll down a little bit and you should be able to kind of engage. And we are keen to hear any questions that you've got, not only now, but also over the course of the presentation. If you're not so keen to use the chat facility, we also have other facilities. You can always email your questions over to us. Feel free to email them directly to myself, and I can pose them to Peter at the end, which is just simply at andy@property-care.org. Or you feel free to use any of our social channels, either on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook. All you simply need to do is, when you go onto those channels, simply type in Property Care Association and we should pop up. We're almost, I suppose, looking at the time, almost getting to that point where we are about to start. We've got a minute or so until we're actually just about to kind of kick off. I'm just having a wee look at the kind of chat window at the moment in time. I can see we've not got a lot of chats on there at the moment. There are a lot of questions. So all I'm going to say is, come on, guys, come and say a wee hello. Now, come and engage with us. We're keen to kind of hear from you. As I said as well earlier on, for those that might miss, we're also keen to hear that if you disagree with us, God forbid, we're keen to hear your views. We're open for discussion. This is as much of us giving out to you as it is for you coming back to us and posing questions and your thoughts. So again, click on that chat facility, if I can get it out. You can tell I've not had enough coffee, and say hello. Well, looking at the time, I can see we're at 8 o'clock here, Peter. So without further ado, let me pass you over to our speaker, Dr. Peter Fitzsimons, and his presentation, Japanese Knotweed, Problem Plant, or Just a Weed?
Thank you very much, Andy. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. This is the second in our series of webinars, which we've just started this year, and which we're looking forward to rolling out more as the year unfolds. And just to confirm the timing for the next hour, I've got a few slides here. I'm going to be running through, take about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a good Q&A session, which hopefully will last 20 minutes running up to 9 o'clock. So as Andy said, please, as we go through the slides or as anything pops into your head, just pop something into the chat room by way of a question. And if we can't deal with them all at the end, we'll definitely follow up just to make sure that any of your questions are answered over the next day or so. So without any further ado, let's crack on and get into this presentation. Here's a little bit of background about me, not that you really need to know much. I'm the technical manager at the PCA, looking after the invasive weed group. I joined the PCA about 2 years ago, but I've actually been involved in and around the PCA, working for member companies for about 30 years. But most recently, I've been working in the wood protection field, both in Germany and for one of our UK manufacturers. And prior to that, as you can see at the bottom, I actually started off my life as a botanist, working in various research laboratories in Scotland and in the Midlands, looking at various aspects of plant growth, particularly in relation to hormone stimuli. And so my career has gone full circle, as you can see, so from plants to plants. But moving right on, let's unpick this title that we've chosen for today. Problem plant or just a weed? I mean, I think most people will already know that Japanese knotweed is a very notorious plant. It's been with us for a long time and has caused an awful lot of problems, particularly in the built environment, but also in the wider environment. But recent research has thrown some of our assumptions about Japanese knotweed into debate. And I'd like to pick up all of the threads that have come from that debate and just talk you through where we are now, where things are moving, and what the consequences of that are for stakeholders within the knotweed management industry. So let's move on to a slide here. Just going to give you a little bit of background about Japanese knotweed now. And I apologize to those of you that already know most of this, but I want to make sure that everybody watching is up to speed and we have all the basics covered. So just give me a few minutes to quickly run through some of the background to Japanese knotweed. It's a non-native invasive plant from Southeast Asia, well established in the UK and Europe since the 19th century. And already by the turn of the century, nurserymen and gardeners were already starting to complain about its prodigious ability to spread away from and outside of the areas where it was planted. And so it was gaining a reputation over 100 years ago for being an invasive spreading plant. All of the plants that we see around the world outside of Southeast Asia tend to be only female plants. And they're all clonal plants which have probably come from some of the original stock that was brought over in the 19th century. So actually that encourages us to think that biological control may one day be possible, because if they are all clonal, then when we do find a solution, then it should be a pretty universal solution for all the plants that we see out there. So it spreads by vegetative propagation, predominantly via the rhizomatous root network, although it can also spread by sections of the shoot material landing on fresh soil and germinating there. So this is a very interesting ecology of the plant. It's evolved to be what we can call a super spreader. This is a very topical terminology to use, so I've applied it to Japanese knotweed, and it produces very fast-growing monocultures. We'll dive into that a little bit more in a moment. But the important thing is that wherever it gets established, that it tends to dominate the landscape very quickly and spread rapidly laterally through the soil to cover large areas. So one plant over 5 or 10 years can cover quite a big piece of ground. For this reason, it's a listed plant under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, is Schedule 9, Section 14. And one of the consequences of this is that it's against the law to plant or allow the plant to spread into the wild. And another consequence of that is that any soil containing knotweed rhizomes is classified as controlled waste under the Environmental Protection Act. The interesting thing about Japanese knotweed, and the thing that draws it very much to our attention, is that it's a plant which is equally at home in the built environment. So, gardens, the surroundings of buildings, brownfield sites, roadsides, railway embankments, and so on, are absolutely perfect environments for Japanese knotweed to grow. Not exclusively in those areas, but it certainly seems to be very at home in that environment. And as a result, a lot of problems have arisen over the years with building codes where Japanese knotweed is present, and the Environment Agency produced a code of practice providing guidance to the industry about appropriate procedures to follow to ensure that the wastes arising when construction works are being carried out in particular are dealt with carefully to ensure that we don't end up making the problem a lot worse than it already is. The so-called 7-meter rule, which we'll come back to in a minute, appeared for the first time in this Environment Agency Code of Practice, and we'll unpack that and discuss it a bit more later. So let's just have a quick look at some identification characteristics of Japanese knotweed very quickly. Fortunately, it's quite a distinctive plant with very characteristic leaf shape. I like to we call this a spade-shaped leaves with a flat-bottomed, with a slightly pointed tips, and the venation is usually quite distinctive, certainly later on in the summer. This classic, excuse me, let me just get a pen here. This classic zigzag pattern here is pretty diagnostic for Japanese knotweed, and it helps pick it up in amongst other vegetation. One of the features of Japanese knotweed you can see here is that it produces quite dense clumps of growth, and over here we can see how it's shielding the, cutting out all the light hitting the ground, and it's also a prodigiously tall plant, growing up to about 3 meters in height. Sorry, let me just get rid of the pen and move on. Okay, so let's have a look at some other features of the plant. It produces these fairly, on the left-hand side here, you can see what's called a crown. These are the old parts of the root network, which are quite fibrous. They're not woody, but they are very dense and can become quite large. And from these crowns, we get the old canes that have died off here, and we get the new growth emerging from the below ground root network. In the middle slide here, we can see the new tips of growth coming up. This is what a lot of them will look like at about this time of year, with the dead canes from last year's growth also being left behind as a diagnostic feature. Let me get that pen again. And if we go over here onto the right, we can see Japanese knotweed is a little bit more advanced here. But what I think this slide shows is that it can be quite difficult to pick out amongst background vegetation at this time of year. It's in amongst a load of what I think is dog's mercury here, which you know, can make it difficult to spot, and especially because the leaf shape hasn't fully established itself yet. So surveyors do need to be vigilant at this time of year to pick it up in these sort of situations. So let's move on. Again, just looking at these canes over here on the left-hand side. Obviously, winter time, this is all we're left with from a diagnostic point of view. But you can see again the prodigious height of the canes, up to about 3 meters if it's a mature stand, and they're usually a very characteristic shape. That zigzag patterning of the stem is usually still easy to spot and pick out. You can see here with the middle slides that we have, you know, a slide showing how the underground energy reserves that knotweed possesses through its rhizome network help it to produce a lot of above ground growth, so that even if it's trapped in a situation where it can't just find light immediately when it breaks ground, it will keep growing over long distances until it can find light. And in this particular case, it's caused an extension which has been built up against this this wall here to be pushed off because of a lack of lateral ties, you know, holding the building to the wall here. But let's not forget on the slide on the right that knotweed is a big problem in the wild as well. And you know, where it occurs, it competes very successfully with native flora. and it's particularly common alongside roads, railways, canals and rivers, where the pieces of rhizome or soil can easily get spread by human movement effectively. So we're largely responsible for the problem that we see on a day-to-day basis, and the solution lies with us as well. So the spreading mechanism for Japanese knotweed is fairly obvious. Let's have a look over here on the right-hand side. We can see some rhizome. Rhizome material, by the way, is effectively a modified underground stem of the plant. And so the rhizome has nodes, which you wouldn't normally see on ordinary roots. And these nodes allow it to produce roots and shoots from any part of the rhizome which is broken off from the network. So classically, if you're digging up or digging around anywhere where Japanese knotweed is present, you can inadvertently find that even very, very small parts of this rhizome material can be spread around and create opportunities for new plants to grow. Here we see how the new plants get established, and you can see just in a very short distance indeed, this piece of rhizome is producing what could be 3 independent plants off this one small piece of rhizome material. This slide down here is just showing how Japanese knotweed shoots can start to grow some long distance away from where the original stand is present. And we'll be talking about the distance the rhizome network can move away from the original plant in some detail in a moment. And here again, we have a gnarly old crown from a fairly mature Japanese knotweed plant. And every single one of those little buds, if they're broken off, would result in a new plant starting in a new location. And so what's the problem? Well, the problem is that Japanese knotweed, all of the properties of Japanese knotweed, its ability, its fast growth, its lateral spread, its height, the density of the stands that are formed, which we can see here, all cause a problem both in the wild and in the built environment. And consequently, we often see Japanese knotweed growing in and around buildings, and breaching through hard surfaces like paths, patios, tarmac drives, and in places like car parks like this. And all that's happening here is that the plant is like any living organism. It's trying to survive. It needs light, it needs water, and if it can, if the surface will allow it to do so, it will grow through to find that light. And given the underground energy reserves in rhizomes, they're often better able to do this than many other plants. Classically, if you build over the top of some rhizomes of Japanese knotweed, this extension or porch here, the knotweed can grow up through cavities within the building from underneath the foundations, and erupt in places where, again, it can find light. So these are rather, this is probably a unique situation relating to a new build scenario. But here's a more typical situation in an existing building where knotweed has just got established at the base of at the end of that pathway there, and is just causing a nuisance from an access or from an amenity point of view. And we'll come back to that later. So I hope that's all okay. What I wanted to say about Japanese knotweed is that because of all of that, it is often cited as being one of the top 10 worst invasive weeds in the UK. And using mechanisms like this, excuse me, just get the cursor back, using this mobile phone app called Plant Tracker, an awful lot of records have been collected, excuse me, of the presence of Japanese knotweed along with other invasive species like Himalayan balsam and giant hogweed. And what we can see is that it's pretty much ubiquitous within the UK. The only areas where we don't have knotweed tends to be the mountainous areas over 2,000 feet, where the sort of alpine climate is a bit too severe, and there's no opportunity for it to get a foothold. But in all of the other areas of the UK and most of the countries of Europe, North America, Japanese knotweed is present pretty much everywhere where it can be. So what we're going to talk about now is get down to the nitty-gritty of why Japanese knotweed is a concern, particularly in the construction sector, and talk about the impacts of Japanese knotweed. We've already talked about the ecological, environmental impact, particularly along rivers and other waterways, for example. The main problem, and the reason why it's listed under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, is because of its ability to dominate the landscape in which it grows. It tends to outcompete all of our native flora, mainly through its prodigious growth rate and its ability to screen out the light from the under canopy and stop any other plants having a chance to survive. Practically the only time where you'll ever see knotweed struggling to dominate the soil is where it's growing alongside mature trees. Which are obviously have a canopy already established. So a lot of the time where in the wild where knotweed really gets going is alongside rivers, and every year, because it's a deciduous plant, it's a perennial, but it loses its leaves every year, and the dead canes obviously will fall over in storms and clog up rivers, weirs, bridges, culverts, and so on. And so it creates a bit of a problem for the Environment Agency in terms of keeping the rivers flowing. Here's a nice slide showing knotweed dominating an embankment here along the River Taff in South Wales. This is quite close to one of the field sites used by Swansea University. And it's just a classic example of how apart from some other vegetation further up the bank here, this is all knotweed here, and in the winter when the water levels come up, a lot of the dead canes that are being produced there every year are going to get washed downstream and cause some consequential problems. So moving on very quickly, obviously there are some structural impacts. We've seen some slides earlier on just showing knotweed growing in and around buildings. It spreads both horizontally and vertically, but it's not a woody plant. So although it has a prodigious growth rate and will spread very rapidly, most of the growth is it's a herbaceous plant, fairly fibrous. It produces bamboo-like canes, but they're not woody at all. But certainly in terms of its structural effects, the fact that it spreads a long way underground in the soil is certainly an issue. It does produce fibrous roots and shoots, which can disturb hard surfaces like paths and patios, driveways, and so on. And that the older crowns, where they become established, can cause a heave. So they can actually cause a complete distortion of things like paving slabs on patios, for example, and under certain circumstances can cause boundary walls, soil retaining walls, for example, to be distorted and pushed over. And here's a slide here just showing a typical example of a bit of knotweed. Some landscaping work's been carried out around this property, and rhizome present in the soil has just been left behind, and over a period of time the plant has enough energy reserves to be able to push new growth up, cause cracking and spalling of the new pathway there. But this pathway is probably just it's a cement path, probably only about a couple of inches thickness maximum there. So the rhizome in the soil, and this is perhaps one of the biggest concerns, can cause problems when it's built over, partly because of the energy that the plant has. Even if you put a concrete raft foundations down, the rhizome has still got enough energy to push new roots laterally, which can then produce plants popping up at the curtilage of the building. But more commonly with ring beam foundations, if knotweed is trapped under the foundations, it will probably grow up through the cavity and can appear inside the property. But over the years, what's happened because knotweed can be quite alarming sometimes when it's growing around buildings, and so the newspapers like the Daily Mail and such like have often stated that knotweed is the cancer of buildings, or that it can knock buildings over or undermine foundations. And some of these claims have been rather spectacular. And when we were reviewing some guidance notes recently, 3 or 4 years ago, we had a discussion with people like the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors and our own members, and decided that some research needed to be carried out to quantify and establish exactly what the scale and scope of the structural impacts were. We'll come back to that in a minute. I just want to finish off talking about the impacts of Japanese knotweed for you, because we haven't finished yet. So if we think about amenity impact, what we mean by that is you can think about amenity as being how the utility of the building or the use of the building. So Japanese knotweed, because it can grow very rapidly and establish monocultures, can cause restricted access problems in certain properties. Pathways can get blocked. This could even involve fire exits and such like things, for example. So it can block pathways and access to parts of gardens, for example. But the main problem with amenity impacts is its nuisance effect, because it is, once present within a property, a challenge to manage and control. If that can either be done by the property owner, in which case there's a certain long-term context to getting on top of how to control the plant, or they may have to engage a professional to establish a long-term management plan. So in the end, the problem is if knotweed is established and somebody carries out, excuse me, just going to find my pen, and somebody wants to carry out some repairs or improvements to their property, and they don't remove all the rhizome material fully, you can get a lot of collateral damage occurring, such as we can see in this slide over in the corner. So here sorry, my white pen doesn't work very well against that background, but you can see here that a failure to manage knotweed properly within a building can lead to consequential costs in the future. Lastly, as far as amenity issues are concerned, we have this spectre of boundary disputes. Because of knotweed's ability to grow laterally through the soil, it is no respecter of boundaries at all. And so consequently, if a property owner has knotweed on their property, it's likely to cause problems in their neighbour's property as well, if it's not managed properly. And this has led to quite a few court cases. One notable one recently went all the way to the High Court, and a ruling was made by the High Court to establish in common law that indeed allowing knotweed to spread into a neighbouring property is a nuisance in law, and that compensation can be sought for the consequential losses or costs arising. And that's an important clarification, because it hadn't been clear for many years exactly what the legal position was. But this is now leading to a re-evaluation of how we assess the impact of Japanese knotweed in properties. So very quickly, just to finish off, as far as the impact of Japanese knotweed is concerned, property development, obviously if Japanese knotweed is present and the rhizomes in the soil are not removed during the ground preparation stage, there can be some quite significant consequences arising, either due to the nuisance effect of knotweed growing up and around the buildings, or due to some actual structural impacts. So generally speaking, for property developers, the presence of Japanese knotweed imposes a high cost on the project. This is just sorry, I'm just showing you here a residential knotweed excavation. But obviously it just goes to show that, you know, the excavation of the soil to some considerable depth, which varies from about 1.5 to 2.5 meters typically. The use of root barrier membranes, and consequent reinstatements. All of these things impose quite high cost on development projects if you want to build on the land. And of course there are environmental costs, because all of these things, the excavation, the removal of soil from site and so on, all involve both a carbon cost and a cost in terms of capacity at landfill sites. Apologize, sorry. So just, you know, summing everything up, we have a plant which at the is extremely well evolved and adapted to establish itself and colonize new ground. It dominates the landscape that it sits in, and it causes a wide range of different impacts which are relevant in the built environment. But what we wanted to do is go back and look in more detail at the structural impacts. And I'm pleased to say that a collaborative project between the PCA, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and the University of Leeds led to a piece of research being conducted to try and put some facts and figures on what the impacts were. And here's the title of the paper that was produced a couple of years ago: Japanese Knotweed, an analysis of capacity to cause structural damage. And also looked at rhizome extension to see whether the 7-meter rule was or wasn't a useful rule of thumb. So I can't go through the paper in detail in the short time that's available, but obviously here's the main takeout from the paper, which was that no support was found to suggest that knotweed causes significant damage to built structures, i.e. To the foundations of well-built buildings on sound foundations, even when growing in close proximity. And in fact, yes, it can cause damage around buildings, but no more than many other plants, such as Buddleia, for example. It was also found that the 7-meter rule, so let me just see if I can get my pen on this, that the 7-meter rule was not a statistically robust tool for estimating likely rhizome extension. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't grow to 7 meters in certain circumstances, and I know for a fact that it certainly does, but statistically speaking, it's not a likely scenario, and something like, 2 to 4 meters is far away more likely to be typical. So based on these findings, the conclusion of the authors was that some of the reservations that are usually expressed about the significance of the presence of Japanese knotweed ought to be reviewed. And indeed, that's exactly what happened, because following on from the publication of that paper, the government asked the Science and Technology Committee to hold a hearing to discuss the implications of the work and what action might need to be taken to incorporate those findings into our codes of practice and so on. As you can see, we were represented at that meeting. Here's Steve, our Chief Executive, giving evidence to the hearing alongside other stakeholders in the industry. This is John Bagley from Institute of Chartered Surveyors, Mark Diamond from the Environment Agency, and so on. So it was an excellent hearing. The report came out a few months later. And again, it's a long report, worth reading the whole thing. There's a URL at the bottom, but if you want me to send it to you, please just send us a little message. I'll make sure it gets to you. But I'm just going to read one paragraph, which I really think sums up the crux of the report. It says that the latest research, which we just referred to, suggests that physical damage to property from Japanese knotweed is no greater than that of other disruptive plants and trees. But Japanese knotweed has some distinguishing features that are relevant. It's particularly hard to eradicate. requires multi-year treatments with herbicide or excavation, and this is not the case with trees or plants such as Buddleia. So they recognise that there's an ongoing risk that the plant will regrow, either because it's only made dormant by herbicides or because fragments of the plant remain in the soil. And I think they've done an excellent job in summing up in one paragraph really what it is about Japanese knotweed, which really sets it apart and makes it a particularly special challenge for not only those working in the built environment, but for people trying to control the plant in the wild. So the consequences of that are, well, first of all, sorry, let's just have a quick look at then, you know, if we make a comparison between knotweed and Buddleia, and we look at all the features of the plants, yes, we know that fundamentally one of the characteristics of knotweed is that it's a fast-growing plant, whereas Buddleia, like most woody plants, yes, it does cause damage to buildings. We see that all the time, but it's relatively slow to establish. Doesn't put on a lot of biomass every year relative to Japanese knotweed. The root system of Japanese knotweed is rhizomatous. That means it can spread by vegetative means and can produce these gnarly crowns, which can cause displacement effects. The roots of Buddleia are somewhat more fibrous and not rhizomatous, although they can regenerate to some extent. So the dispersal mechanism for Japanese knotweed is quite unique. Buddleia produces a prodigious amounts of seed, which are themselves a big problem, but it doesn't create quite such a challenge in terms of construction sites and new build, for example. Japanese knotweed can penetrate tarmac surfaces, paths and patios and such like things, whereas Buddleia tends to be a plant which will germinate on masonry surfaces and if allowed to establish over a number of years can cause damage to those structures where it germinates, but it doesn't tend to grow through paths and patios which are laid over the top of the seed bank. And from a management point of view, Japanese knotweed is not at all easy to manage. It's quite a challenge. We'll talk about that in a minute. And whereas Buddleia, to some extent, as long as the property owner has the will to do so, is relatively easy to manage in terms of dealing with individual plants because they don't tend to spread through the soil. We can just cut down the plants, treat the stump, or dig up the roots, and without worrying too much about future consequences. So I hope you think that little comparative analysis was useful. It's just tried to put things into context, which I think the Common Select Committee had already done. But let's just move on and just talk about what the Common Select Committee asked the industry to do. They made various recommendations and asked these organisations to go away and look at their own guidance, and we'll talk about those individually. I just want to say about this last one here, the Civil Mediation Council, the Select Committee were concerned that there were many boundary disputes between property owners that appeared to lack the appropriate degree of mediation to settle those disputes. And we did actually write to the Common Select Committee explaining that the availability of mediation in disputes is not the problem, but that guidance for solicitors working in this area probably needs to be developed and improved, and that may well appear in the near future. But let's look at what we've done with the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. Yeah, I think most of you will be familiar with this guidance note, IP 27, which enabled valuation surveyors to try and put a risk category on Japanese knotweed where it's present during surveys, and largely based on proximity to the building. And the Parliamentary Select Committee asked us to look at the 7-metre rule, and so various meetings have taken place with everybody involved in the sector, and we started to discuss the guidance. There is a revision of the information paper. In fact, it's being upgraded to a guidance note taking place now. This work is being led by Philip Santo. This is Philip here. And this is a very young Steve back in 2012 when the original guidance document was first produced. And so it was well overdue for updating anyway. But the key thing is, if you look down here at the bottom right of the slide, that, you know, when surveyors are highlighting the presence of knotweed, they've tended to include a 7-meter buffer zone as being a zone of influence. And the way that we've been representing that risk is likely to change in the near future. Just to emphasize that, 2 years ago, even before the research on structural impacts was published, we were starting to review the risk categories in the RICS document and talk about different ways of representing the risk, certainly modifying the 7-meter rule. And one of our members has come up with the idea of having different risk zones, so that within 1, 2, 3 meters of the stand of knotweed, there is a higher risk zone than between, say, 3 and 7 meters. Because we certainly don't want people to take home any idea that knotweed can't grow to 7 meters away from the plant. It certainly can, but we do want them to understand that the risk of that is much lower than it is within, say, 3 meters of the stand. So that's work that's ongoing, very much likely to result in some output in the next couple of months. The Law Society were asked to look at their property information form, TA6, particularly in regard to how it relates to knotweed excavation. And this is the part of the form here that you can see. I've just highlighted the box on the form there that asks the question, is Japanese knotweed present? And the guidance supporting the document has been changed recently, so they now emphasize the fact that before answering the question, you also need to assess the presence of Japanese knotweed in the soil, not just above ground. And so that creates quite a challenge for valuation surveyors because they don't have X-ray vision, and sometimes the presence of knotweed in the soil is not easy to determine during a evaluation process. So we hope that there's going to be further discussions between the Home Buying and Selling Group and the Law Society. I believe they're developing a digital version of TA6 as we speak, and the way that knotweed is assessed during valuation surveys and reported on TA6 forms will continue to be discussed further. The Environment Agency, DEFRA, were also asked to look at their guidance on the management of Japanese knotweed, and they already have funded further research. One project is looking at how knotweed is dealt with in other countries other than the UK. So major countries in Europe like Holland, Sweden, France, for example, and also Canada and the United States of America, where knotweed is very widespread as well. And we want to see if we can learn anything from how knotweed is managed in those countries. Just pushing quickly on, of course, PCA have a very important role in terms of representing the wide body of knowledge and skills amongst our members, professional knotweed management companies, ecological consultancies, and so on. And so we will constantly review our code of practice to make sure that remains up to date and remains the best possible guidance to everybody, both contractors and valuation surveyors and mortgage lenders. We're working very closely with the Institute of Chartered Surveyors and all those other organisations to make sure that the guidance is up to date and reflects best practice. So what do we need to do as an industry? First of all, valuation surveyors need to be aware of the new TA6 guidance and the new RICS guidance note once it's published and incorporate that into their reports. Knotweed management companies, they need to make sure their surveys and reports are likely to be are dealing with the question of whether knotweed is present within the soil as well as above ground. Our management plans that are produced for the management of knotweed need to be backed up by independent insurance, as they already are, so that we continue to give confidence to buyers and lenders where house conveyancing is taking place. We expect to see that the frequency of excavation programs in residential settings will increase, but of course the downside of that is that will also increase the cost of knotweed management. So herbicide treatment programs for Japanese knotweed will remain an effective strategy for dealing with Japanese knotweed, but only in situations where development is not planned because of concerns over knotweed rhizome dormancy following herbicide treatment. So to summarize, this is the last slide. Japanese knotweed is, in our opinion, more than just a weed. It's a particularly unique and problematic plant. Its fast-growing invasive habit makes the control and containment of the plant difficult. It's capable of significant disruption in and around buildings. The effective mapping, treatment, and long-term management is absolutely essential, and our members are skilled and experienced professionals dealing with knotweed on a day-to-day basis, and are best placed to give homeowners, mortgage lenders confidence in how this plant is managed in the future. They offer fast response, flexible options regarding treatment strategies, and all backed up by insurance-backed guarantees to enable the property sales process to continue. So that's been 40 minutes of entertainment, I hope, education maybe, but I think it's time now to say just thank you for watching and hand back to Andy.
Well, many thanks, Peter. I hope that hopefully we all agree that very, very informative, and a big thanks to everyone who's been kind of engaging with us on chat, and also for the individuals that have been actually contacting us via our social channels. I'm conscious of time, just very quickly kind of moving on, question time. Now, folks, I am going to say just right from the start, we've had quite a waterlog of questions that have actually come in. I doubt we're going to be able to answer them all. However, what I will say is, and hopefully Peter will say yes to this, anything that we can answer right now, I will pass over to Peter, and I will get Peter to contact you directly just with any of the questions that you've got. Peter, I'm just looking at the list of questions here just at the moment in time. If I start off with just some of the questions that have been posed in just prior to the webinar actually starting. A question from Gabriel Manuel. Gabriel, I'm guessing you're contacting us from Spain. Hopefully you're all well. Question is, can you see COVID-19 having a large impact on the growth of knotweed?
Well, yes, I have been thinking about that a little bit, Gabrielle, but I mean, not a direct effect, of course. I mean, the problem is that with the restriction on movement that's taking place at the moment, the shutdown, the lockdown, if you like, of movement and business and commercial activity, a lot of knotweed that should be under continuous management is maybe not going to get treated or managed this year. There's a window of opportunity to treat Japanese knotweed with herbicide spray programs between around about June and October, and we can only hope that some degree of normality in terms of movement and business activity will be able to resume after, say, June or July, so that existing management plans for Japanese knotweed can be picked up and continued this year. Otherwise, a lot of management plans are going to be interrupted, and that could give Japanese knotweed a new opportunity to establish itself where it was otherwise being controlled.
Okay. Next question we've got, a question from Chris Burke. I think this is the Chris Burke that I actually know at Wise Knotweed Solutions. If it is, hello, Chris. This question is, the courts seem to be busy lately with claims against surveyors for missing Japanese knotweed. How can we protect ourselves against this sort of litigation?
Well, I'd be surprised, Chris, if it is Chris from Wise Knotweed, I'd be surprised if any of these claims are being made against CSJK qualified knotweed surveyors, because one of the most important things that we always stress, and it's raised in our code of practice, is that it's very important to establish at the time of the survey that whilst you are an expert knotweed specialist and you recognize the plant and you know the telltale signs and you know where to look for it and where it's most likely to be found, that you also need to explain to the receiver of the report that you can only see what you can see. And consequently, if knotweed is missed, it's usually because it's been obscured, or it's been hidden, or it's been managed in a way which means that it couldn't have been seen by a reasonably competent and conscientious surveyor. I think most of the claims that you're talking about in court have probably been surveys that have been carried out by as part of a valuation process or a pre-purchase survey. And the problem seems to be the interpretation of the law in terms of whether knotweed in adjoining properties, if it's present, should also be noted at the time of the survey. And there is guidance on this, and I believe the legal precedent is that if it was reasonably easy to see during the course of a walkover survey or a cursory visual survey by a chartered surveyor, for example, then it should have been mentioned in the same way that it should be mentioned if it's present on the vendor's property, for example. But if you can't see over the fence, if there's a high boundary wall, if there's a lot of other vegetation which is obscuring the knotweed in an adjoining property, then you're not expected to be able to have X-ray vision and be able to see it. So I think we just need to look at the actual guidance, make sure that we're following the guidance and being reasonably conscientious, but also being very careful about how the reports are written so that clients don't have unreasonable expectations about what can be seen. One of the interesting things about the TA6 form, by the way, is that because it's raising the issue of knotweed in the soil, I think it does possibly mean that visual surveys are no longer sufficient. And that knotweed surveyors may need to take a sharp spade with them on every survey that they go on and carry out some moderately intensive explorations of the soil around, particularly around the boundary of the property, if they're not seeing any visual signs of knotweed, just by way of some degree of confirmation or otherwise as to whether there is or isn't knotweed present in the soil. So food for thought.
Well, here we've got a couple of questions that all kind of have a similar theme. This particular question comes from Carwyn Templeton, but Martin Ball, hello Martin, out there as well, has similarly kind of posted something. Question is, we think we would all agree that Buddleia and bamboo can be equally, if not more destructive than Japanese knotweed. But why are these plants ignored?
Yeah, a very good question. Good morning, Carwyn. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, it's an intriguing scenario. The thing is, bamboo in particular is a relatively new player in this game, new kid on the block. It became popular as an ornamental plant around about the 70s, maybe more in the 80s, just because of all the gardening programs and the garden designing programs where it was being promoted as a sort of a screen plant, an attractive sort of boundary screen. And so we're starting to see all the consequences and problems of that now. Bamboo has many similarities to Japanese knotweed in terms of the rhizome root network, lateral spread. Not every bamboo species, only some, not all of them, the so-called runners rather than the clumpers. And they do cause very similar sort of impact to Japanese knotweed. The problem is at the moment that it's not that widespread. It's still somewhat restricted to the gardens where it was first planted. It hasn't spread into the wild. It's not a ubiquitous feature of the landscape like Japanese knotweed is. And so consequently, the Non-Native Species Secretariat, the government body that looks at the Wildlife and Countryside Act, have put it on the list of Schedule 9. So it doesn't have the same regulatory status as Japanese knotweed. And these are some of the reasons why it doesn't always get dealt with the same way. Buddleia, I think I tried to analyse the whole situation with Buddleia. Yes, it causes a lot of damage in buildings, but really, if we analyse it, most of the damage is usually in neglected or derelict buildings. Frankly, if it was in somebody's garden, it's an easy plant to manage. It can just be pruned back, chopped back. It doesn't contaminate the soil in the same way that Japanese knotweed does. And consequently, yes, it's important to be aware of the potential for damage, but yes, it's also very easy to control and manage.
Interesting. Well, next question from David Graham. Can an insurance-backed guarantee be provided that covers re-infestation?
To some extent, yes. I mean, IBGs, insurance-backed guarantees, are largely guarantees which cover the trading status of the contractor that has carried out the work. So if a contractor issues a guarantee against Japanese knotweed regrowth, that's what the insurance is covering. But there's nothing to preclude companies from issuing their own guarantees underwritten by their own insurance, if you like, precluding, protecting the client against knotweed growth in the future, where there's no knotweed present or known to be present at the time that the property is purchased, for example. That's very much something that could be done, but I'm not sure whether many companies are doing it, because I'm not sure there's a demand for it. I mean, if knotweed is not present and it's not being managed, then people aren't tending to look for assurance that it won't be present in the future. It's a slightly difficult one. I think, so definitely something worth discussing further, I think.
Well, staying on this insurance theme, question from Hamish Gordon. Hamish asks, why does there appear to be a recent shift by the insurance sector to cover new setup businesses? His broker seems to be telling him that the industry has wavered increasingly over the last 12 months. Why should this be the case? Very interesting. I don't know if you could shed some light here.
Yeah, Andy, I think the question, I'm going to have to make an assumption here. I think this question is about professional indemnity insurance. And the professional indemnity insurance marketplace in the construction industry overall, not just in relation to Japanese knotweed, has shut down. To all intents and purposes, it's shut down for new business. And we think it's largely as a result and a reaction to the Grenfell disaster and the subsequent inquiry. There's a lot of concern with the insurance industry that they maybe haven't always understood the risks that they were underwriting with PI insurance policies. And the Grenfell disaster has put that under the magnifying glass. And in the end, it wasn't the contractor who did the job wrong. It wasn't the material manufacturer who supplied unfit materials, because apparently the paper chain shows that they were upfront and honest about what the product did and didn't do. But it was the designer of the building, the person who was responsible for specifying the combination of the use of that product in that situation, and all the details of how it was fixed and installed, that led to it not performing in the way that was expected. So all of the liability for the Grenfell disaster seems to fall on the PI insurance for the design of installation, rather than anything to do with the materials or the installation. And as a result, the PI insurance industry as a whole is going through, I think, a major analysis of how they want to move forward. This means that people who already have existing cover continue to get it at not too badly inflated premiums, but those that haven't already got it are struggling to get any cover at all. And that's just a fact of life at the moment, and something that we're trying to help our members with day in, day out.
Yeah. Well, I've next question up. Question comes from Martin Ball. Martin, many thanks for sending in lots of your questions. I'm just going to apologise in advance. We're not going to get covered all your questions, but I will get Peter to email you over. But one of these questions is Japanese knotweed in the same bracket as ragwort and giant spear, thistle, etc.? I think what he's trying to describe here is why isn't it in the same category as all the other invasive weeds?
Yeah, well, those weeds that he's just mentioned are native weeds, and they're listed under the Weeds Act of 1959, I think it is. And Japanese knotweed isn't in the Weeds Act, and the problem with those weeds is they're deemed to be poisonous to livestock. So they have a special status. They come under different legislation. They're deemed to be harmful for a completely different reason to Japanese knotweed. It's not to do with their negative environmental impact. They're part of our native flora, and you know, a lot of botanists would be happy to find them in most situations. Spear thistle in particular produces beautiful flowers that are covered in insects every summer, but they are potentially poisonous to livestock. And so consequently, there is legislation which requires landowners to manage the plants to prevent them being harmful or a risk to livestock on that land or surrounding land. So yeah, different kind of legislations for weeds, but nothing to do with non-natives.
I'm just conscious of time here, and I think I'll probably have to make this the last question. And simply because it's a celebrity name, I'm going to read out this question. So this question comes from what looks to be our former Doctor Who, David Tennant. David's asking, are there any other Schedule 9 plants that are an issue for property developers?
Which are, excuse me, Andy, which are what for property developers?
Are an issue for property developers.
Yes, indeed there are. Yeah, I mean, nothing quite like Japanese knotweed, you know, primarily because of all the features that we talked about earlier on. But certainly things like Himalayan balsam, I mean, all of the Schedule 9 listed plants, there are a lot of them. I mean, I know if you include the Wildlife and Countryside Act and the European Invasive Alien Species regulations, there are something like over 70 listed species, all of which have some significance to property developers before they break ground. I mean, they are required to consider, the impact. So all of these plants impose on the property developer a responsibility to decide whether any waste arising, any soil that's removed from the site is or isn't controlled waste and how it needs to be managed. And the issue is whether the soil contains propagules of those plants. In the case of knotweed, that's root material, rhizome. But in the case of Himalayan balsam, it's usually just the seed bank. But of course, you can deal with the seed bank usually much more easily by doing a soil scrape. Maybe the top 12 inches or so is more than enough to remove most of the Himalayan balsam seed bank. But, you know, it's a bit different to digging down 2.5 meters to get rid of all the knotweed rhizome in terms of volume and cost. So yeah, Schedule 9 is important in property development right across the board, but knotweed tends to be more expensive, more involved.
Oh, no worries. Well, guys, just to remind everyone as well, I mean, for all the questions that we've got, and we do have a stack loads, I am going to get Peter to kind of answer those questions just directly for yourself. Just for those looking for a little bit more information, just want to point you across to our invasive weed technical document library. You can see the link there. You'll see a whole variety of documents that are associated not just with Japanese knotweed, but with other associated weeds as well. For our international audience that's out there at the moment in time, feel free to kind of go in there and download the information. And it's a variety of guides, best practice, and treatment solutions. There's also as well some blogs, some recent blogs that we've actually stuck out here. One is Japanese knotweed ever eradicated? You can tell I've not had enough coffee this morning. And also we need to talk about knotweed. You can simply just go onto the Property Care Association website, go to our news section, and you should be able to find these blogs there. Lastly, just to let everyone know, there will be a replay of today's slide deck available. It should come out to you in the next 24 hours, but also we're going to make it available to all as well, so you can share with your colleagues and anyone else that you kind of feel that might be relevant to. That should be up and running by the end of the week, and I will ping you an email all that's registered, just to kind of let you know about that. Some information of some stuff that's actually coming up. We do have a couple of other webinars coming up. On the 9th of April, we've got our webinar on the evolution of damp control. This is one of our more quirkier webinars that's getting led by our very own James Berry, which kind of gives a bit of a history of where we've come from and how we got to here in terms of damp control and damp proofing. And following on a couple of weeks after that, we have quite a hot topic at the moment in time in terms of cavity wall defects and cavity wall construction. That's taking place on the 23rd of April, so just kind of bookmark that. But for those that want to see any kind of webinars that are coming up, you can see the link there, www.property-care.org/webinars. But we're also keen to hear from yourselves that if there's a particular subject that you guys want to hear about, please do let us know, and you can just email me at andy@property-care.org. Lastly, but not least, let me just say a big thanks to everyone that's listening. A big thank you to Peter for his presentation, and also just with everything that's going on in the world and all the uncertainty that's taking place in the world with the COVID-19, please keep safe, everyone, keep healthy, and hopefully we see you in one of our future webinars. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.